Welcome to The Untold with Heidi Buzo. Today we will be talking about the Caesars Act, which took effect actually today, and other expected sanctions by the United States against Iran and Russia. To talk about this, we are joined by Dr. David Adesnik, Senior Fellow and the Director for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And we're also joined by Stephen Heydemann, Director of Middle East Studies at the Smith College and is a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute. Thank you so much both for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for having us.
All right, so I want to start, we know that these sanctions that took effect starting today, because they will be increasing throughout the year, according to James Jeffrey, the special envoy to Syria. We know that Bashar al-Assad, his brother Maher al-Assad, his wife Asma al-Assad is also included. There are so many other people. It's a very big list of people who worked and helped the Assad regime and the Assad family before the war and during the war. Who could start and tell us a little bit more details about the Caesars Act?
Well, I'd be happy to jump in, and David, please feel free. It'd be great to have your perspective on this as well. Syria is a country that's lived for many decades under U.S. sanctions. It was initially sanctioned actually back in the very late 1970s, when it was one of the first countries put on the list of sponsors of state terror. And so the Caesar Act in some ways can be seen as another incremental set of sanctions that are applied on a country that's already facing enormous sanctions from a large number of different directions. American sanctions are only part of the story. The EU sanctions Syria, a number of individual European governments sanction Syria, Australia, Canada, Japan have all imposed sanctions on Syria. So the country operates in many respects, having been almost entirely isolated from many global markets as a result of sanctions. What makes these different is that the Caesar Sanctions Act extends sanctions to third parties. It includes within its scope all those who provide support to the Assad regime that contribute to its ability to wage war, as it has since 2011, against its civilian population. And so for the first time, all of the firms, the government agencies, the individuals who have been providing economic support to the Assad regime that permits it to engage in attacks on civilian targets, on schools, on hospitals, on bakeries, to besiege communities and so on, all of the actors who've made it possible for the Assad regime to conduct those kinds of activities are now themselves going to be sanctioned. And so the effects of this act, I think, have the potential to be quite significant. We have to keep our expectations in check. Nothing, I think, is going to turn on a dime. But over time, what I think we will see is that the access of the Assad regime and its supporters to the Lebanese economy, which was a backdoor they used to keep themselves in business, will become narrower. That the Gulf regimes that were interested in normalizing ties with the Assad regime are going to think twice before they extend those kinds of policies. And even the key backers of the Assad regime since 2011, Russia and Iran, which are already under sanctions, are going to find that individuals and firms face additional penalties if they do engage in economic support activities with the Assad regime. Now, just one last thing to emphasize about this, because the impact of the sanctions on civilians has been a big topic of conversation. And it's really important to stress that the sanctions do not include humanitarian support, medicine, food, those kinds of goods that ordinary Syrian citizens need so badly. And they have been intentionally excluded from this Sanctions Act. Now, that doesn't mean that those goods will be readily available inside of Syria, and we can discuss that more. But it is important for your listeners and viewers to know that this is not an act that intends to harm civilians, just the opposite. And I think that's probably a useful starting point about what the act includes and doesn't include.
David, what would you like to add about one of the important points that Stephen mentioned, that this act includes Assad's supporters and everybody who was attempting or hoping to help his regime?
So I'd like to just briefly pick up on Stephen's final point about humanitarian aid, and he's right that there are exceptions for those things, and there, occasionally some bureaucratic hurdles to overcome. But one of the bigger points, and I'm always surprised to see how frequently critics of sanctions forget this, is that the U.S. has also provided $10.6 billion of humanitarian assistance to the people of Syria, and that includes those living under Assad's rule. We do not exclude them, despite the fact that it might put pressure on him if we denied them those sustaining goods. Also, the UN as a whole has spent around $42 billion providing assistance, obviously channeled from American donations, from European and other donations. So it's not just that we don't block humanitarian aid, it's that we are one of the top providers and work with other allies to provide it. When Syria's own backers like Iran and Russia, provide token aid, but mostly are providing the weapons that help cause the atrocities. In terms of what to add, actually, one thing I would like to is just a little bit about Caesar himself. I think perhaps people should understand the man who's the namesake for this, that he's a Syrian military photographer. As he told me when I met him a few years back, before the war, he had a fairly mundane job. It was more like going out to car crashes and potentially taking photos of victims. So it was a little bit morbid, but it was sort of a normal function. And then during the war, what began to happen is that, and I don't remember exactly when he started being stationed at the military hospital, is that the interrogators would start dumping off bodies on a regular basis, and it became his responsibility to photograph them. And as he emphasizes, he saw the way they were whipped, beaten, burned, strangled, and emaciated. I mean, really, if you look at some of the photos, it reminds many people, it reminds them of other exhibits at the Holocaust Museum, where you can see some of those exhibits. I often think of the photos of the emaciated war prisoners in Bosnia and Srebrenica. But anyhow, he was in a hard situation because, of course, he is nominally a regime loyalist in this position and is thinking about leaving the country to keep himself safe and to keep his family safe. And he makes this decision to basically stay for upwards of a year in order to start collecting this evidence and bringing it out with him. And as he says, he saw friends, he saw neighbors in those corpses. He knew people waiting outside the hospital to find out the fate of their relatives. And he couldn't tell them that he knew they were dead and had seen their bodies, because if he let anything slip, his could be the next body. He was even worried about expressing any emotion, any sympathy for what he saw, despite the brutality of it. And then again, he did ultimately get out. It's interesting, the FBI has their digital evidence laboratory reviewed the evidence he brought with him, 55,000 images. Many of them he took, many other photographers on his team took, and they show authentic corpses in authentic places, that there's no question about the evidence that this presents.
Stephen, you've worked on this issue and you've seen the progression of what happened in Syria since you were at the U.S. Institute for Peace. Probably even all of us, we never expected things to get this bad. But knowing where the economical situation is today in Syria, and now with these new sanctions being presented, what does it mean for the regime? And I heard what you said about the civilians actually already being hurt by the regime, and that these sanctions were made to prevent the civilians from being hurt. But on a larger scale, if we talk about the Syrian economy, is it going to collapse?
Well, I think the Syrian economy is probably closer to collapse than it's ever been in the period since the conflict began. And there are a number of factors that are driving the Syrian economy into this kind of downward spiral. And frankly, the sanctions are not the most important of them. On the one hand, we have the massive destruction of the Syrian economy that is a result of 9 years of violence, the vast majority of which was inflicted on Syrian infrastructure by the Assad regime and its allies as it worked to retake territory from the opposition over time. The regime essentially, with Russian advisors and Russian military support, adopted the kind of strategy toward its opponents that we saw the Russians use in Chechnya.
Exactly.
It was a scorched earth strategy in which they were mercilessly pummeling civilian neighborhoods with artillery and with attacks from the air, with barrel bombs and so on. And the result has been a massive level of destruction that even 2 years ago, 3 years ago, had produced an unemployment rate of something like 70%, had driven the vast majority of Syrians into poverty long before this more recent cycle of economic decline began. But what has accelerated the cycle are a number of additional events. One is the collapse of the Lebanese economy, an economy that, as I mentioned earlier, has played a pivotal role in providing an economic backdoor for Syria's own economic activities, for the activities of smugglers, of the regime's business cronies, who would move their money into Syrian banks, who would use Syrian traders to bring in goods banned under sanctions and so on. And when the Lebanese economy basically collapsed in September, October of 2019, we saw an immediate impact in Syria. That was the period in which the Syrian currency first began its very sharp, very precipitous decline. That was followed not long after by a collapse in oil prices as a result of a dispute between Saudi Arabia and Russia, which has diminished the capacity of those two countries to provide the kind of financial support that the regime has long required. And then on top of that, we find the COVID-19 pandemic, which did lead to some brief economic lockdowns in Syria, which has certainly made issues of international movement of goods more difficult. It's had a significant effect in Iran, one of Syria's leading financial patrons. And so what we find is that the Assad regime is now in a condition, is now facing a set of circumstances in which the pillars that it relied on to sustain its economy in the face of sanctions have all weakened, have all eroded. And then today we have these sweeping new sanctions added to the mix, which introduces much, much more uncertainty among those third parties who had been working with the Assad regime about whether they should continue to do so. And the result has been dramatic, frankly. Inside of Syria, already in anticipation of what the Caesar sanctions might mean, we have seen some small protests in the Druze capital of Sueda in the south, close to the border with Jordan, a city that was entirely neutral for the most part throughout the conflict. We've seen growing expressions of discontent from within the Alawite constituency of the regime, who feel that they sacrificed enormously for a decade and are now being asked to make additional economic sacrifices that are pushing them beyond the brink of poverty. Some are fearing whether or not there will be waves of starvation.
Yes, and we will talk about what's going on inside of Syria, because this is a very important point, that places where there are also minorities are now protesting inside of Syria.
Correct.
But I do want to go back to David about Hezbollah's question. You know, Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed terrorist militia in Lebanon, was blaming the U.S. for the shortage of dollar in Lebanon. Obviously, Hezbollah was very much involved in the slaughter that was carried by the Assad regime throughout these years. But what do you think the implications are going to be for Hezbollah now moving forward?
Well, to pick up on what Stephen said, I have a feeling that the crisis of the Lebanese economy may have even more direct implications for Hezbollah, that, you know, they're basically running the government there in all but name. And it's interesting, if you take a pair of graphs of the Syrian currency and the Lebanese currency and look at their value compared to the dollar, I mean, you'll see they're basically declining almost entirely in lockstep over the past 6 to 8 months. And that's actually a very important indicator of just how closely it's the relationship between these two economies, more than anything else, more than the anticipation of Caesar sanctions, that has been driving the Syrian economy into the ground. It's always worth asking, well, how could it get any worse? I mean, haven't we been hearing for 9 years about the suffering and deprivation? But to give you a sense, when the currency falls that way, it often sets off major bouts of inflation. In this case, the most widely cited estimate is from the UN World Food Program that a basic basket of goods, cooking oil, beans, flour, has increased 111% in cost over the past 12 months in Syria. And then you get anecdotal reports that it's sort of the typical salary of a government worker can purchase about a watermelon or a bag of lemons now that it's become so desperate. So people are going to have to, dig into whatever their last final savings may be. When it comes to Hezbollah, I mean, they've already spent a lot of money and they've lost a lot of fighters in this war. I mean, strategically speaking, pre-Caesar, I mean, to the extent that they had a rising profile even in the Sunni world, despite their Shiite denomination following the 2006 war with Israel, where people perceived them as standing up for the Arab world or the Muslim world, they became the butchers of Sunnis in tandem with Assad. And so their, reputation suffered accordingly. There was already some reports. I don't think they're anything close in substance to the current situation of the Syrian economy, but of Hezbollah losing the ability to pay some of its fighters. That was, it was in the New York Times, the Washington Post, but it wasn't the kind of sort of extensive situation where it's very clear the way we see now with either of the two economies. I mean, in terms of going forward, certainly, Assad probably is going to defray even fewer of their costs. It's likely they're more dependent directly on Iran. And in that sense, the U.S. maximum pressure campaign against Iran is depriving Iran of its, financial resources. That, of course, Iran, the reasons there was major protests starting last fall in Iran, it was a direct response to their increasing the price of gas, which had been heavily subsidized. So, Hezbollah has been very open that it gets a lot of money from Iran. Nasrallah often couches it in lavish praise of Iran's support for the revolution. And also they're going to continue fighting. I mean, Hezbollah took, from what we understand, significant casualties during the Idlib offensive in February and March. And they're going to continue to be called upon because they have, capable fighters that can be put in the field to, go up against Assad's remaining enemies, where his own forces can't offer that so much.
I just wanted to supplement what David said briefly. I think we're at an interesting moment in Lebanon in terms of Hassan Nasrallah's influence and Hezbollah's influence, because he gave a speech yesterday in which he called on Lebanese to reject the Caesar Sanctions Act and not to comply with them. That's not going to happen. Lebanese banks are going to comply with the Caesar Sanctions Act. They already comply with existing sanctions. Lebanese businessmen who want to continue to operate outside of Lebanon are going to comply with the Caesar Sanctions Act, at least formally. And so what we will see over the coming weeks and months, I think, is a demonstration of how little Hassan Nasrallah has been able to essentially pressure or coerce Lebanese business actors into rejecting the Caesar Sanctions Act. And I have a feeling that that message will not go unnoticed within Lebanon.
And what about Hezbollah's drug dealing? This would be also another revenue where Hezbollah would continue to try to profit from, even though the United States is also doing a lot of activities and work to stop that from happening in Central and South America, where Hezbollah has a lot of connections and it actually is working there. Do you want to add anything to that, David?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was about a month ago, actually, that a shipment from a company owned by Rami Makhlouf, Assad's maternal cousin, who he's effectively purged and stripped of assets recently, was caught, and it was found that there was large amounts of drugs in it. There have been other major shipments of Captagon in boats that are ships that departed from Syria. I think it might have been in Cyprus where it was located. So it's not even just Hezbollah. It's clearly that there are elements of the regime as well that are making very large amounts of money, shipping this possibly to the Persian Gulf, possibly to parts of Europe. Captagon is generally more consumed in the Gulf. And it's very large amounts. I've certainly advised Treasury and the State Department to make that a part of the inquiry. By its nature, however, it is always illegal, and therefore it's being done sub rosa, hopefully in ways designed to evade law enforcement. So unlike certain things where the Caesar Act may take things that were once done semi-overtly, or people didn't have as much to fear from enforcement. Obviously, international narcotics trafficking is always one where they have a fair amount to fear, barring cases where they can actually, bribe certain governments to ignore it. But I think there's just two slightly different classes of activity. Both are important, but they're being targeted in different ways by sanctions and law enforcement.
So we did talk about the Assad regime, of how that's going to affect the regime itself and what's going on inside of Syria. But what about Assad's backers? Let's start with Iran. How do you think this is going to impact Iran, which is already impacted by the maximum pressure campaign by the American administration?
David, why don't you start with that?
Absolutely, thanks. So I would say that, I think part of the strategic thinking here is that the more it costs Iran to prop up a failed state and a pariah state in Syria, the harder it becomes. It adds to the drain of maximum pressure that we're taking away their revenue by sanctioning petroleum and other exports. And then we'd like to make it as expensive as possible so they have to use as many of their remaining resources to support Assad. It's not a direct thing. I don't think there are many Iranian firms that are going to be in a worse position. They're already generally contemptuous of sanctions. There may be front companies that are exposed. There may be individuals who pay a price. But we should consider, how much is it that Iran pays? It's obviously not all that transparent. We had a fairly well-connected member of the Iranian Majlis. Their parliament claimed that between 20 and 30 billion had already been spent supporting the Assad regime during the war. Some scholars, I think Stephen's done some work on this, have put numbers substantially higher. I've seen an estimate of as much as $15 billion a year, and adding up to over 100 billion during the course of the war. There's many different streams between lines of credit, the actual cost of deploying militia like the Fatemiyun and Zainabiyun, the cost of deploying actual Iranian troops, including IRGC officers, to the country. So it's a little hard to pin down, but it's clearly quite substantial for, Iran is 4 times as many people as Syria, but it's still not an especially large economy. So these are quite big amounts.
Yeah, and the people in Iran are protesting. And specifically when they were protesting, they were talking about how much the Iranian regime is spending in Syria while they're hungry. This is exactly how the situation are. What would you like to add about this, Stephen, about the impact on Iran?
Well, I think David really covered the ground on that very well. I would only emphasize the reality that sanctions are not going to deter Iranian activity. The level of Iran's financial support for Syria is going to be much more heavily influenced by the impact of sanctions, US sanctions on Iran on the one hand, and the effect of falling oil prices on the other. Those are the two big factors that will, I think, constrain sharply Iran's ability to continue to prop up the Assad regime financially. I don't know if we will see any shift in its willingness to provide ground forces in support of the Assad regime. We may, but it's really offering them lines of credit and providing financial assistance where I think we'll see the current combination of sanctions and low oil prices affect Iranian behavior. At least it's something we should be watching for.
Go ahead, David.
I'm just going to jump in. There's an interesting twist on the impact of oil, because on the one hand, Iran is losing huge amounts of revenue because we've cut off exports with sanctions, and then what they even can export, the value is going down further. But one of the strange twist is that because they have so much oil, they can barely store it. They've actually been increasing shipments to Syria, which likely are not even paid for by Assad. Maybe the case with gasoline as well, meaning the refined product at the end. Of course, they were giving it to Venezuela. They made quite a few headlines by sending 5 tankers there. In this case, even more sanctions are going to find it difficult to stop that. I've always argued with people in the government that would be cutting off one of Assad's most important lines of support. The challenge there is that most of this goes through the Suez Canal, and Egypt pursues a sort of a policy of non-interference, claiming the canal is open to all who would use it for peaceful commerce, and they don't define violating unilateral US sanctions as part of the problem. If there were ever UN sanctions, Egypt might change its tune, but of course Russia will always block those, potentially China as well. So this is one area where, for all the bad news, Assad has some good financial news, that at least he's getting more of these petroleum products, and it's fairly hard for us to stop. Although we can get in more detail later if it's relevant, just how you can prevent, ships which have problems with their safety and registration implying the waters.
So we did talk about one of the backers, which is Iran. What about Russia? Because this is also another country that has backed the Assad regime since they intervened in Syria. And we are hearing about other sanctions that are being introduced against Russia. But in terms of the Caesars Act, how is that going to affect Russia?
Well, I think Russia is a very interesting case because for some time, I think Russia has recognized that it could find itself saddled with a client state that is barely hanging on financially, that is politically, diplomatically isolated, and that even though there's often been a great deal of criticism of the notion that the US could make Syria a quagmire for Russia, I think there is some concern within Russia that in the absence of a political settlement of the conflict, a negotiated settlement that provides a kind of legitimating framework through which foreign assistance could be provided to reconstruct the country and through which the Russian military could begin to downsize its presence and so on. I think Russia is aware that in the absence of those kinds of developments, it is likely to find itself stuck in what increasingly looks like a quagmire in Syria. And so even apart from the Caesar Sanctions Act, there has been a recent series of very thinly veiled or not veiled at all criticism of the Assad regime coming out in the Russian media, which I think we have to understand as an effort to signal to the regime the extent of Russian unhappiness with its unwillingness to engage seriously in the diplomatic process going on in Geneva, and with its rejection of the kinds of compromises that would be needed to give Russia a military and diplomatic and economic off-ramp that would permit it to reduce its commitments in Syria. And Russia sees very well the growing level of discontent that the Assad regime's conduct is generating domestically. Now, interestingly, one of the things that was a thorn in the relationship between Russia and the Assad regime was a sense on the part of the Russians that it was internal corruption within the Assad regime that was foreclosing financial opportunities to Putin's cronies who hope to use Russia to advance their own economic interests. And so one of the reasons it has been speculated for the conflict behind Rami Makhlouf and Bashar al-Assad is that the Russians themselves saw Makhlouf as too predatory, as someone who narrowed the scope for Russia to engage and make profit in Syria. And so there was pressure put on the Assad regime to try to put Makhlouf in his place, partly as a signal to him and to other business cronies that they had to get their act together to create space for Russian business actors to become more profitably involved in the Syrian economy. Now, it's precisely those actors, I think, who will have to weigh whether it remains worthwhile to engage in Syria now that the Caesar Sanctions Act is in effect. Because we've seen a number of them in the field of phosphates, in the field of oil services, in the tourism sector, in other areas in Syria, in which Russians have been interested in using their role as Assad's savior to put themselves in privileged positions to get reconstruction contracts, to get business deals. They're going to have to think about that now. It's too early at this point to say how Caesar sanctions might shape the thinking of Russian oligarchs who see an opportunity for profit in Syria, but they have to be working through the trade-offs that would come if they were to continue to do business in Syria and fall under those sanctions, because they all have global interests. They all have interests outside of Syria. And they would be concerned, I think, if the relatively small share of business they do in Syria led them to face sanctions that affected their business operations globally. So we are in a different situation now. But here too, as in other areas we've discussed, we have to recognize that Caesar fits into a bigger context. It's not the whole picture.
This is very interesting, and especially that Russia has been always trying to get those contracts, put Putin's name or Russia's name on certain like industries or ports or areas in Syria. Is that even legal? I want to ask you this, David, because, you know, we're talking about a dictatorship that slaughtered its own people. Then we have this other dictatorship that came into the picture, also participated in war crimes against the people in Syria. And based on that, they're trying to get all of these benefits. But is that something that you think is legitimate, even if we're talking about finding a deal eventually where Russia would be willing to give up Assad? Should the United States or the Western world accept that role from Russia after all they've done?
Well, I mean, if there ever were space for a negotiation, you know, and for the moment, I don't think Russia is at the point yet where it's willing to surrender its interest in the regime. Remember that it's been there for decades, working very closely with Hafez al-Assad. The Soviet Union just equipped him with really extraordinary amounts of arms to prepare him for wars with Israel, especially in 1973, remained close. So this is a multi-generational relationship. And, you know, people occasionally float the idea of, is there another Alawite leader or potentially a Sunni leader who could replace them? And Russia is in the situation where it would have to be, you know, leaving behind the certainty of a 50, 60-year relationship for something relatively unknown. But if it ever came to a place where there were negotiations, I mean, I have a feeling if we actually thought, the US actually thought that there was a prospect of getting Russia to push out Assad, then to some degree its financial interests would be secondary. That, you know, what's there for Russia to take in terms of investments, because so much has been destroyed, it's a little hard for them to even find those lucrative opportunities. I mean, one of them is, for example, Stroy-Transgas. It's actually already sanctioned for other activities, but it's effectively has the Russian concession on Syrian phosphate production. It took that effectively from Iran, which thought it had a clear promise from the Assad regime that an Iranian company would get that, but it went to the Russians instead. And in fact, this has been a pattern in general. It seems promises to Iran don't materialize the way promises to Putin do. Nonetheless, there's not a lot of great opportunities. You know, there's the port opportunity at Tartus. It seems that there was talk of figures that are not entirely credible of Russia investing $500 million to upgrade it and make it a trading hub. But there's a question of whether that could ever happen, given where Syria is and its continuing isolation. And of course, part of what Caesar does is it ensures that kind of continuing isolation, because the construction sector, the engineering sector, and petroleum sector are all specifically called out as ones where one cannot do business with the regime or its intermediaries. And of course, we were talking about corruption a little while ago, but to make that point, the tentacles of the regime through various intermediaries go so deep that there are almost no major firms you could really do business with that are not effectively government controlled or offering more support than the US Treasury would allow under sanctions.
And Russia was trying to promote for the idea that we want to, quote unquote, reconstruct Syria. And that was the attempt by Russia. And there was some actual companies and countries that were willing to go into Syria and to invest. Do you think this is out of the picture at this point?
I think there's going to be a feeling out process. So for example, the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, they seem to constantly be sort of pushing the limits of what they can do without provoking too much of a backlash from Washington. So I can't remember if it was January 2019 or 2018, but it was Mohammed Hamsho, someone on the US blacklist, was welcomed at the head of a trade delegation to the Emirates, which really was something the US apparently pushed back on. And, you know, they've opened—
And he's now on the sanctions list, Mohammed Hamsho,
yes, he
right?
was then, and now he's been redesignated. There's
Yes.
additional tags on him. And so it was also the issue, they've opened the embassy. There's been some surprisingly positive statements about Assad himself from the ambassador. Mohammed bin Zayed sent a tweet that was surprisingly friendly, you know, couched as just a humanitarian issue. But the Emirates keep trying to push that envelope. And of course, we talked about Lebanon before, which has these, you know, they're geographically immediately next to Syria, deep connections across the border, both licit and illicit. So there's going to be, I think, a cat and mouse game that happens. It's not a matter of, Caesar sanctions are in place, and there's going to be a class of people who know it's time to, cut their stakes. There's going to be another class of people looking for new ways to either hide their activity or see how determined the U.S. is to really enforce it. And so we haven't mentioned it yet, but, this morning, to sort of mark the Caesar Act coming into effect, the State Department and Treasury announced 39 designations, some of them redesignations of those already on the list, but trying to send the message immediately that we are going to pursue this. And you have both Jim Jeffrey, our special envoy, and Secretary of State Pompeo saying this is only the beginning, that if you don't meet conditions on improving human rights and other violations, this is going to keep happening. Nonetheless, whether with Iran, with other places, there's a lot of ingenuity and creativity in ways to get around sanctions. So we're going to need some creative and consistent enforcement.
Stephen, you wanted to say something in the beginning.
Well, I was only going to add that what David said underscores why it's important for us to keep our expectations in check. I think describing this as a cat and mouse game between those who see sanctions as a chance to increase their profits and those who are looking for a rigorous enforcement of the sanctions is exactly right. But that doesn't distinguish these from other sanctions. That's one of the things that the Treasury Department does. And I would hope that in this case, the effort to track down, identify, and bring within the Sanctions Act these kinds of characters who see this as a chance to increase their business, to expand their activity, to increase their profit. I would hope that would be a very, very rigorous and a wholehearted effort on the part of the U.S. government.
When we talk about different phases of these sanctions that are going to continue to snap throughout the year, what else could be sanctioned, and how much more could the administration really pressure Assad and his backers?
Well, let me mention two quick things, and then again, I'm sure David has information to add. The Caesar Act gives the administration 180 days to make a designation as to whether the Syrian central bank is a money laundering operation. If it were to decide that it is, and I suspect that designation is likely, this is one additional very, very significant effect that the Caesar Act could have on the Syrian economy and on its on its ability to conduct business abroad. The other is that the 39 individuals who were designated today and companies that were designated today were all Syrian. And so we haven't yet seen how the act is going to be applied to these non-Syrian third-party economic actors. And that's something that I think will send an exceptionally powerful signal. As soon as we begin to see this list develop into one that applies to those third parties, I think we'll be in a better position to assess its effectiveness and its impact.
David?
Yeah, I think what I would add is a return again, especially to Lebanon, to some degree to the Gulf, that if you want to know where is the U.S. going to put pressure, there's a parallel discussion in the United States about policy toward Lebanon. And there, both because there had been sort of the facade of an independent government, although that is sort of worn away with Hariri's resignation, and now you have really a Hezbollah majority in parliament, a Hezbollah government, but still not officially so. It's how much pressure are we going to put? Because there's always been this argument, if you push too far, it'll become an entirely overt Hezbollah state, and it'll be even worse than it is now. Now, it's hard to get much worse given what's going on in Lebanon, but there's also the fact that we provide quite a bit of money to the Lebanese armed forces. I think it's been at times $100 million a year. I think I'm inclined to put much greater scrutiny on that there's too much influence of Hezbollah in the armed forces. The original rationale was supposedly that the Lebanese armed forces, or LAF, could stand up to Hezbollah. I think we know that's never going to happen. But then there's been sort of a retreat on that side of the argument to saying, well, we don't want to damage any of the remaining pillars of stability in Lebanon. I don't know how much there really are any. I mean, people have long pointed to the financial sector as one of those. The same head of the central bank, Riyad Salameh, for 25 plus years. And I think, what we've seen, obviously, since the crisis broke out last fall, is that it was all sort of a house of cards, that it's falling apart because it was always based on, ethically questionable and financially questionable engineering of sort of over-rich payments on interest. So, and Lebanon still wants a bailout. whether from the IMF or someone else. And I think there's going to be a substantial debate in the US. I certainly don't think a bailout should ever go forward without major reforms that would push all unelected actors out of the government and corrupt actors, because it runs so deep. But I think when possible targets come up for sanctions under Caesar, some of the most prominent targets may be in Lebanon, but it's going to feed into this debate about how much we can afford to accelerate or affect the Lebanese instability and possibly worsen it. And there's going to be some voices saying, no, leave those targets alone. Even if we can hit them under Caesar, it's not worth doing so. Now, I would tend to be skeptical of that argument, that this has always been an excuse for inaction with regard to Lebanon. We've seen, examples like the Lebanese Canadian Bank that would basically was running hundreds of, 200 million a month in transactions, basically laundering it for Hezbollah. When it was finally brought to account, it's almost a decade ago now, the bank basically collapsed because it couldn't afford the penalties. So there will be a balancing act, but I hope the government pushes hard and doesn't let people sort of get a get out of jail free card.
They're talking about other sanctions that are being proposed against Iran and Russia. Do you have any information about this? Because this is not talking about the Caesars Act. This is just separate.
I'm not tracking what additional sanctions might be applied. I think the Congress is discussing a number of additional measures. I suspect, David, you have much more information about them than I do.
Yes, yeah. The RSC.
Yes, I was wondering.
Republican Study Committee, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's a report that came out this week. The RSC is a grouping within the Republican caucus, and they had sort of a global strategy report, and it recommended very tough sanctions on Iran. I think a lot of them are ideas that we have both developed and promoted at FDD. It's where is it that Iran hasn't been hit? So, for example, natural gas. That you would be surprising if we hit oil, we hit petrochemicals. Why aren't we also banning, say, Iranian exports of gas to Turkey and other places? So that's a potential target. Sometimes it's just a matter of identifying more companies as being affiliated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or IRGC that, again, they sort of spread their tentacles throughout the economy. It's not always clear. The more we can name them. Sometimes it's an enforcement matter that with petrochemical sanctions, they are still, trade statistics suggest they're selling a fair amount to the Emirates and elsewhere, and it's a major source despite being sanctioned, so we have to pursue those people. Even with oil, it's still going to China. It's possible Malaysia is a major sort of place where Iranian oil gets rebadged as Malaysian oil and then passed on to China. So this is the kind of, I think, spectrum of activities where we could put more pressure on Iran. I think with Russia, it's harder for me to say specifically.
Can I just jump in a bit?
Yes.
I think we have to be aware that the recommendations of the Republican Study Committee represent the views of a relatively small group of members within one branch of Congress, and that the likelihood that its recommendations are going to make their way through the legislative process are pretty small. I also think, without commenting on the Iran section of the report, which I haven't seen, I did see the Lebanon section, and I think it deserves pretty close and careful and critical scrutiny. I think it has a number of ideas that are worth pursuing further, but I think in some respects it makes some fairly irresponsible and in my view, even counterproductive suggestions. For example, naming a politician like Fawzi Salih, who hasn't been in the public eye for a very, very long time, who is in no way a Hezbollah person, as if he's comparable to some of the worst actors within Hezbollah and deserving of sanctions, strikes me as not just wrong, but potentially very dangerous for someone like Salih. And so I think when it comes to the Lebanon section of that report, I'm afraid that perhaps some of those who advised the RSC in putting it together may have been given a little bit too much latitude to introduce their own criticisms and concerns about Lebanon into the findings of the report. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. It's out. It'll be discussed. I just hope that there's an opportunity for those who have experience in Lebanon, who know these actors, to engage in trying to clarify the circumstances and position of some of those named in the report.
But doesn't concern you also, Stephen, on the other side, in the Democratic side, in the Congress, where there's a lot of leniency towards the Iranian regime, towards Hezbollah. And we saw that obviously with the previous administration. And even now, I mean, the Joe Biden campaign advisor was talking about that they would not re-enter JCPOA because, I mean, it was pretty disastrous for the region.
I actually am not sure that I would describe the Democrats as too conciliatory with respect to Iran. I think there was a greater appreciation for the JCPOA among the Democrats, certainly. But there was, in addition, a significant interest among a large number of experienced foreign policy hands in the Democratic Party in an approach that differed substantially with that of the Obama administration in making very clear connections between progress on the JCPOA and Iran's regional policies and regional conduct. And in my view, that was the most significant shortcoming of the JCPOA, is that it seemed to give Iran a pass in terms of its regional behavior. And so I think, I have no particular insight into the Biden campaign, but I would certainly hope that it would be willing to pursue a path that included renewed discussions about the possibilities of limiting or even ending the Iranian nuclear development activities that we were most concerned about, and taking on Iran's regional role in its regional policies. I never, frankly, understood why the Obama administration pushed so hard to avoid any kind of linkage between those two outcomes.
If you want to add something, David.
Just briefly, in that regard, I think Biden is trying to hedge a little, that there's obviously pressures from both directions on him, that there are those in the party, fully committed to returning unconditionally to the JCPOA. That means without concessions, likely unwinding all of the additional maximum pressure measures. On the other hand, we've spoken to people around Biden who recognize that, leverage has been created. And even if they want to return to a new deal, even if they're skeptical that Trump is ever going to go to a new deal, so things have to change dramatically, they don't want to just give it all away without getting improvements that they generally recognize, whether it was the lack of missile control, some of the regional issues, they'd like to do a little better. But I'd leave it at that.
Lastly, it's about the protest, which Stephen talked about in the beginning. These regimes, including Hezbollah, obviously we know that Iran is in a very bad shape. The public itself are just hoping, and they say from within Iran on Twitter, that the only way with this regime is for the people to topple it. But now we're seeing in Syria, we're seeing protests within minority areas. You talked about Sueda, which is a Druze area. There's Jeramana, which is right next to Damascus, that has Christians, Druze, and other minorities. I mean, this is new, and this is just the beginning. Now, today, the Caesars Act just started. What are the options to these regimes, militias such as Hezbollah and the Assad regime in Syria, with all of the unhappiness that the people are expressing at this point?
Well, I think we have to recognize that your characterization of the deepening of discontent and anger within Syria and within Lebanon, frankly, toward the Assad regime and Hezbollah is quite intense. It's quite widespread. It cuts across communities. And I think it is becoming a source of concern, certainly on the Syrian side for the Assad regime. What I think we always have to ask ourselves, however, is what the mechanisms are through which these individual grievances, or even these community level grievances and anger and protests, might aggregate into something larger that could pose a significant threat to the regime. We have seen some speculation in the media that the Assad regime, for instance, is facing a second wave of an uprising similar to the one that broke out in March 2011. I think it's far too soon to draw that conclusion. And so until, until we're in a position when we can see the kind of organizational networks or the kinds of linkages being developed that would provide a way for these dispersed, decentralized, local level expressions of grievance to become something better organized and larger, I think what we're likely to witness is just this continued grinding away at popular views of the regime, sporadic outbursts of discontent, individual expressions of concern, and the growing courage and willingness of individual Syrians to use the channels they have to make clear the difficulties that they're facing. And one of the ways in which the Assad regime has been a little bit savvy is that it has begun to talk the talk of anti-corruption. It has framed the takedown of Rami Makhlouf as a response to his corruption, positioning Assad as someone who is acting in the interests of the Syrian people. The Syrian parliament, which is a toothless rubber stamp for the regime, has been positioned as the address that people are invited to complain to about their economic grievances. And so the regime is trying, it's struggling, but it's trying to find ways to respond to what it sees happening on the ground. I don't know how much success they'll have with those kinds of strategies over the long run. But my main point is simply that until we see some way in which what we're witnessing now is able to coalesce into a broader movement, I would be a little bit cautious about assuming that there'll be a bottom-up surge of resistance to the regime that could have constructive consequences.
David, you've written a lot about Syria. You've been working on the subject. How do you view what's happening today inside of Syria in terms of the protests coalescing and at the same time having the Caesars Act start being effective?
Well, I think one potential jumping off point for looking at is comparing it a little to what's been happening in Iran over the past few years. And there, it's increasingly frequent. We see these protests with tens, even hundreds of thousands of people against the regime, very clearly political, not just against economic grievances, but basically saying down with the dictator, down with Khamenei, stop spending our money in Syria and in Gaza. And that really could accelerate to a certain point. And it has to do also with the willingness of people to die for the cause and the willingness of the government to kill. And the last round was resolved with a really remarkable number of people prepared to march and die, but also an increase in Iran's willingness to kill its own citizens to prevent a revolution. And so if we, by analogy in Syria, right, we're seeing much smaller beginnings. I mean, leaving aside the fact it's a smaller population, we aren't seeing mass protests, and people are going to be hesitant. I think obviously no one could forget how, the Assad regime butchered protesters the last time around, is still, snatching people off the streets, has an estimated 129,000 in prison, mostly being tortured. So people are going to ask, is it worth my life? And if I go out, is someone else going to go out and risk their own neck to bring down this regime, if I really think that's what's best? I think that many people, who sort of characterize the social media protests, because there clearly is dissatisfaction in regime-loyal areas in Syria, as Stephen mentioned, that they also have almost sort of a cultish loyalty to Assad, that, it's the old it's only the king's ministers who are the problem, not the king himself. That of course it's these terrible people around Assad, and they'd like to preserve that fiction that it's not Assad himself. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, will it grow? Will people, if they don't see improvements, and there's very little reason to think they'll see improvements in material conditions, there's no one who can really make that happen in Syria, will they start coming out in larger numbers? If they do, what will the response be? So far, there's been some fairly limited crackdowns on what's happening in Suwaida, and will that encourage people? And it's sort of a game, each side watching the other, seeing how far it's willing to go. So I'd say it certainly bears watching. We're at a very early phase. We would want to see things, if we were to be more confident in projecting a real mass movement, we'd have to see more of that mass.
I guess there's going to be so many more conversations about this subject. I want to thank you so much, David Adesnik and Stephen Heydemann. Thank you all for watching and listening with Yohevi and The Untold. I would look forward to hearing your thoughts and your questions, and to like and subscribe to the show in the channel, and I'll see you next time.